Well, I'm in regular dialogue with the telecommunications companies in relation to the COVID issues generally and the border restrictions and any difficulties they may be facing. Now, specialised telecommunications technicians move around the country to deal with network issues, and what the telcos have said to me is they are having great difficulty in getting their technicians across the border from New South Wales to Queensland. They've sought exemptions, they've not been granted. It seems the Queensland Government does not seem to be concerned about the importance of keeping communications networks operational. Now, this is of concern, particularly as we come towards the season where natural disasters are regrettably a regular part of the calendar, both bushfires and, of course, in Queensland, cyclones. So there's work to do in terms of network hardening and network preparation, which requires specialist resources to cross the border from New South Wales to Queensland. And to date, regrettably, the Queensland Government, I understand, from the major telcos has not been granting exemptions to allow that to happen. So I've written to the Deputy Premier and the Health Minister highlighting this issue, encouraging him and his government to focus on the issue, because it would be very unfortunate if on the one hand, while maintaining public health measures in relation to COVID, there were network failures which equally have the capacity to compromise public health and safety.
Well, what's the potential cost of not doing anything about this, about requiring the workers to quarantine? What's your worst case scenario here?
Well, the worst case, of course, is that the specialised skills that are needed to repair network or to upgrade network, those skills are not made available because the right people cannot go into Queensland, and as a result, telecommunications network in Queensland are less prepared than they should be for bushfires and other natural disasters, or alternatively, that the network becomes less reliable. There are failures which are not dealt with promptly. Let's be clear, telecommunications networks are very complex, sophisticated organisms, and there are people with specialised skills that the telcos deploy around the country, and it is very important that they are able to go to locations and do the necessary work to maintain the reliability and sustainability of telecommunications networks.
So phones don't work in those sort of circumstances, those sort of disasters. Can that cost lives?
Well, we saw in the bushfire season in 2019-20 that when you have network outages, network failures, that presents significant public safety challenges. Now, our government has taken a number of measures, including our $37 million Strengthening Telecommunications Against Natural Disaster funding package to further strengthen telecommunications networks, but ultimately their continued operation depends upon skilled, expert technicians, and sometimes it's necessary to go to physical locations. It might be to make repairs to a base station, it might be to repair broken optical fibre, whatever it might be. If people with the relevant skills are not being permitted by the Queensland Government to cross the border from New South Wales, that is bad news for the sustainability of telecommunications services, and I do encourage the Queensland Government to reconsider this matter. I've written to the Health Minister and Deputy Premier alerting him to this issue, highlighting to him that I have received significant expressions of concern from our telecommunications companies that they are finding it difficult to get their specialised staff, their specialised network staff, their technicians and other experts into Queensland, and I've urged the Minister to have the Queensland Government revisit this issue.
Minister, what's your view of the border closures issue more generally? There was some speculation this morning that a little blip in the news poll was because the PM was going against popular opinion in Queensland and WA and asking for the borders to be opened up. What's your view on where as a country we're headed on this issue?
Well, our government's been pretty clear about the importance of needing to strike the right balance. Of course, we must protect public health, and we've led from the outset on doing that. But as the Prime Minister has said, we can't stay under the doona. So the Prime Minister, through National Cabinet, has been leading work on this, and in a range of areas. We are working with the states and territories to look at the process on these issues. Certainly in my own portfolio, as I say, I've highlighted to the Queensland Government this concern that's been raised with me by the telecommunications sector about the difficulties in getting specialised staff into Queensland across the border. And I know that ministers in a range of portfolios deal regularly with state counterparts, and those are constructive dealings, constructive engagements, and that's as it should be.
Let me ask about Google and Facebook and these reforms to see media companies paid for their content. The draft code out for consultation. When could these measures actually be in place? When do you expect them in place?
Well, we're working through a careful, methodical process, which started, more than 2 years ago when then Treasurer Scott Morrison charged the ACCC with conducting a major inquiry into the digital platforms Google and Facebook. And since that time, we've worked through a number of steps, including most recently earlier this year, we upgraded the previous direction we'd given to the ACCC. So the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, had previously directed the ACCC to begin work on a voluntary code regulating the commercial engagement between the digital platforms, Google and Facebook on the one hand, and Australian news media businesses like News Corp, Nine Entertainment Limited, Seven West, and of course a whole range of smaller businesses and regional businesses as well. And we upgraded that direction to say, please develop a mandatory code, because all the advice we were getting was the work on the voluntary code was going very slowly and was unlikely to deliver an outcome. Where we are now is that the ACCC issued a draft of its mandatory code. That happened on 31 July. The month of August was taken up in consultation, and all of the stakeholders, including Google and Facebook, had the opportunity to put in their views and submissions. The ACCC is now considering all those matters before it gives its final advice to government. So that's important. It needs to weigh up these issues carefully. But we've been clear. We envisage legislation being ready to introduce to the Parliament before the end of the year, so that we can move forward on this issue. But of course, as we weigh up the final form of that legislation, we'll consider the advice provided by the ACCC, the final advice, which in turn will be informed by its extensive consultations with the digital platforms and of all of the other stakeholders.
So it could be in force early next year, say?
Well, our aim is to have it introduced into the Parliament before the end of the year. Of course, it then needs to be debated and voted on. Now, both Labor and the Greens have made some statements about their views in relation to the need for this mandatory code. But of course, we'll need to work through with them and other, particularly crossbench senators, their views on these issues. But certainly, the next step will be to, informed by the ACCC's final advice, develop legislation and introduce it into the Parliament before the end of the year.
OK, but then you'd expect it to be in place next year, wouldn't you?
Well, in the ordinary course, you would expect that if legislation is introduced before the end of the year, that the processes that you'd work through could be worked through in time to have legislation in place at some point next year. But as you know, issues like Senate committees and other things can add time. But certainly in terms of the next step, that's to get the legislation into the Parliament before the end of the year. That's our commitment.
OK, so these Google and Facebook threats to leave Australia or not run any more Australian media content, what do you make of those? What happened? Did something similar happen in Spain? And were you heartened, I guess, by a statement from Google last week which indicated they might have softened their stance on the code?
We've seen these kinds of statements and indeed threats from the giant global digital internet businesses before, as we've sought to regulate in a range of areas that we as the elected government of Australia consider appropriate. As the Prime Minister has talked about publicly, when GST was introduced on digital transactions below a certain level, Amazon threatened to leave the country. And they did suspend operations briefly, but they were back reasonably soon afterwards. You asked about what's happened in countries like Spain and Germany. The ACCC, in its very thorough inquiry, looked carefully at what happened in a number of European countries, and that has informed the particular approach that it's recommended to government. And I'd make the point that we have very consciously dealt with this as a competition issue. We've asked our competition regulator to pursue it. We haven't dealt with it, for example, as a copyright issue, which is the way that some of the European countries have tackled it. Now, ultimately, what we want to do is move forward, get in place a sensible code. We will, of course, take account of the feedback from the digital platforms before the final version of the legislation is introduced to the Parliament. So this is a genuine process. We're about seeking feedback, seeking comment, and so I'd say let's wait and have a look at the final version of the legislation, and I'd simply make the observation, and both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have said similar things. We have seen these sorts of statements before from these giant digital, global digital companies, but ultimately the sovereign government of Australia reserves the right to make the laws that apply in Australia, and if you want to do business in Australia, we expect you to comply with those laws.
Were you heartened by Google last week, though, appearing to move on it?
Well, Google did put out, I think it was a blog post last week, where they made some statements about recognising that, I think I'm paraphrasing them, something along the lines of that if there was a reasonable code, that they were ready to work with that. Words of, I think, broadly that sort of import. Look, at the end of the day, we will work with all of the stakeholders. We'll take account of their views. We'll arrive at a decision that we think is the appropriate balance in all of these issues, and then it'll be a job for the Parliament of Australia, the democratically elected Parliament, to legislate, and we'll expect companies that do business in Australia to comply with the laws passed by the democratically elected Parliament.
And finally, Mr Fletcher, in terms of the budget, there's speculation on more infrastructure, funding, some sort of wage incentive for new employees today, certainly income tax cuts coming forward, business tax breaks. Is this a situation where the old debt and deficit concerns just go out the window because we just need stimulus at this time?
Well, as the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have pointed out, one of the reasons we've been able to respond well to the challenges of COVID is because of our fiscal discipline since 2013 and getting the budget back to balance in the last financial year. You know, that's all about preparing for a rainy day, and COVID has certainly been a rainy day. As the Prime Minister has said, as this budget's being framed by the Treasurer, it's about stimulating aggregate demand, boosting jobs, but beyond that, the Treasurer will bring it down on October the 6th and all will be revealed.